Hello, my name is Spencer Liebel. I'm an assistant professor and clinical neuropsychologist in the Department of Neurology at the University of Utah. My presentation today is an introduction to neuropsychology. By way of an agenda, I'll provide a brief overview of neuropsychology, a brief historical background of how it came to be. Then I'll talk a little bit about the brain itself, its structure and function. I'll talk about the methods in which neuropsychologists measure this structure and function of the brain. I'll talk about the disorders that neuropsychologists might be asked to evaluate using these methodologies. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about the educational and training path one needs to take in the United States to become a neuropsychologist. And I'll talk a little bit about the employment and career options for a neuropsychologist. So what is neuropsychology? So neuropsychology is simply the scientific study of the relationships between brain and behavior. It explores how brain structure and function impact cognitive and emotional processes. The need for neuropsychology and how it came to be as a science was really pushed forward a great deal, unfortunately, as a result of the First World War, as many servicemen experienced brain injuries and subsequent changes to their thinking and emotional states that required further exploration and rehabilitation. This science of clinical neuropsychology has since grown, I want to say exponentially since that time, though it has changed a great deal as well as technology has changed. As a historical background, we'll talk a little bit about some of the more famous and impactful case studies and scientists who have helped neuropsychology become what it is today. And we'll start with the case study of Phineas Gage. Some of you may have been familiar with Phineas Gage and what happened to him. Phineas was a railroad worker in the mid-1800s in the United States. He was known by friends and family to be a happy, hardworking person who was generally pleasant. One day, while working on a railroad track, an explosion sent a metal rod through the skull of Phineas. It entered below, as you can see, his left eye and exited through the front portion of his skull near the top. Surprisingly, Phineas survived this injury and the rod was removed. What happened next became of great interest to both his family and friends, as well as physicians and scientists of the time. Phineas's personality changed after this injury, where once he was happy and a hard worker, he was known to be rude, irritable, quick to anger, and he was much less reliable at work. This was of great interest, as I said, to a physician who documented these changes extensively. And this case study was one of the first and maybe one of the most impactful that demonstrated how injuries to specific portions of the brain or a lesion to a specific portion of the brain may affect how one behaves and how one thinks. As I've said, this case study has been cited numerous times and really helped highlight the neuroscience or the relationship between brain injury and behavior. Around the same time as Phineas were several scientists who were looking at and investigating how injuries to specific parts of the brain may affect such functioning. One of these was Paul Broca. Paul Broca investigated how lesions or an injury to a certain part of the left temporal lobe affected how individuals produced speech, the grammar, the prosody, the rate of their speech. Around the same time was Carl Wernicke's research, and he looked at how injuries to a different part of the left temporal lobe affected how an individual may understand or comprehend speech. The work of Broca and Wernicke was significantly impactful for the development of neuropsychology because it demonstrated that lesions or injuries to different parts of the brain may affect different parts of thinking or mental health. So taken together, Phineas Gage and the work of Broca and Wernicke and others that I don't have the time to mention demonstrated that areas of the brain are differentially affected or affect cognitive and behavioral functioning. Following Broca, Wernicke, and Phineas Gage was the exponential growth of technological methods by which people were able to measure brain structure and function via neuroimaging, which we'll talk about later. Briefly, I want to talk about the brain as it relates to a neuropsychologist's interests. As you may know, the brain may be divided roughly into three primary portions. The first is the cerebrum, or the top portion of the brain, as it sits upon the cerebellum and brain stem. The cerebrum are these pictures here in blue, orange, purple, yellow, and green. The cerebellum sits underneath the cerebrum and is involved with things like fine motor coordination, walking, gait, and some thinking processes as well. And then finally, the brainstem, which is that stalk-like tube that holds up the cerebrum and cerebellum. And the brainstem is primarily in charge of things like heart rate, breathing, etc. Focusing back on the cerebrum, we'll talk about specific brain regions and their functions. As we've talked about, injuries to certain regions cause changes to certain functions. And we'll talk about the cerebral cortex. This is the outer covering, or the last portion on the outside of the cerebrum. And the cerebral cortex is primarily dedicated to things like thinking, memory, things like this, planning, decision-making. But there are also structures deep inside the brain that have critical functions, things like the hippocampus, which is critical for forming memories. Next to the hippocampus in these deep areas is something called the amygdala, which is critical for fear processing and emotions. And then, as we talked about with Phineas, there's things like the prefrontal cortex, or the front part of the brain, that is important for things like personality and executive functioning, or higher level thinking. There are many more that I don't have time to go into now, but this is to illustrate that specific regions of the brain are in control of or mediate certain processes. The brain is divided roughly into left and right hemispheres that mirror each other. The left hemisphere, as can be seen in this individual's hand in the picture, is primarily devoted to things like language and memory formation. The right hemisphere is mainly devoted to things like visual spatial reasoning, or how we move and navigate our bodies in space, or how we visualize things in our mind. The corpus callosum is a highway or a tract of neurons that connect the two hemispheres. It enables these two hemispheres to communicate. It should be noted that while I differentiated left and right hemisphere functions, there are many processes that are shared across hemispheres, and very few brain functions are primarily located in just a single area. So what are some of the methods that a neuropsychologist uses to measure brain structure and function? As we talked about, in the earliest days of this science were things like lesion studies, or how specific injuries map onto specific behavioral and cognitive functioning deficits. This method is not as common anymore due to the development of advanced neuroimaging techniques, which I alluded to earlier. So now a neuropsychologist is not asked as often to identify a specific lesion location, because we're able to, via technology, look inside the brain with things like magnetic resonance imaging, positron emissions topography, and EEG. These neuroimaging techniques allow the scientist or the physician to evaluate brain structure and identify lesions or damage that way. So the neuropsychologist isn't as often asked to do these things. Another method, and the primary method by which a neuropsychologist does their work, is through assessments of cognitive and mental health functioning, measuring things like language, memory, and executive functioning, and mental health, and many more that I can't list here. So what is the role of a neuropsychological assessment? There are many, and this is not an exhaustive list, but a neuropsychologist might be asked to perform an assessment for diagnostic purposes, like differentiating between a psychiatric and a neurological disorder, or distinguish between two neurological disorders. Or they may be asked to help detect early onset of specific disorders and predict how those things might turn out. They're also asked frequently to do screenings of people's cognitive and behavioral functioning in order to verify if things are changing or not. Neuropsychologists are often asked to do an assessment as well to plan patient care and future care, to guide treatment in research settings and in forensic or medical legal evaluations. All of these roles change and vary by position, by physician, by referral source, but these are some of the ways in which a neuropsychologist might be asked to employ their science. So how does a neuropsychologist do a neuropsychological assessment? There are a couple of modalities, the primary being pencil and paper evaluations, meaning a neuropsychologist, as demonstrated in this picture here, sits across from a patient and asks them to do certain tasks. Some of these are verbal based, like speaking back and forth, some working with hands, some mild writing, things of this nature. And these behaviors are noted on protocols and documented in a way that can be quantified or counted. Relatively recently, computer-based neuropsychological assessments have begun to be developed that measure some of the same things like memory and language, but are done via laptop, iPads, or desktop computers. And then finally, a neuropsychological assessment is by definition flexible in that it can be used, like I talked about, as a screening measure where a very brief, maybe 10 minutes is spent with a patient trying to figure out what is going on, if anything. Or they might spend many hours with a patient employing many methods of measurement to figure out what is going on to help a physician or plan treatment. A neuropsychologist might do this on an inpatient basis, like in the hospital, at the hospital bed, or they may do so on an outpatient basis where the patient brings themselves to the neuropsychologist in a clinic or a private office. So really, a neuropsychologist works in many different roles and employs many different modalities to do their work. What are some of the disorders that a neuropsychologist is asked to help differentiate or identify? This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the more common neuropsychological disorders are things called mild cognitive impairment and dementia, as seen in this first point. Sometimes a physician and a neuropsychologist will want to know, is a patient presenting with something called Alzheimer's disease or dementia with Lewy body, or do they have a dementia or mild cognitive impairment due to HIV status? A neuropsychologist is often interested in how cerebral vascular disease affects the brain. Things like stroke affect how people think and cause lesions. Disorders of epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, movement disorders like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, cancers, and neurotoxicology, things like alcohol exposure, exposure to lead, may affect brain function and may be one of the reasons why a neuropsychologist is asked to provide an assessment. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is some of the more common ones that we are asked to evaluate. So how does one become a neuropsychologist? In the United States, after you complete your undergraduate training, you attend an accredited PhD or PsyD program in clinical psychology. There, you spend about 4 to 5 years doing coursework, practicum, or trainings, and are mentored by neuropsychologists in the science of neuropsychology. Following your PhD or PsyD program, a neuropsychologist attends a clinical psychology internship where they specialize in neuropsychology, and this lasts for 1 year. Following internship, a neuropsychologist attends what's called a clinical neuropsychology postdoctoral fellowship, which are 2 years long. Following that, they obtain licensure at the state level to practice clinical psychology. So below here, I have my training path as an example. I attended graduate school and got my PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Georgia. I then moved to Milwaukee and did my clinical internship at the Milwaukee VA Medical Center. After that, I moved again to the University of Michigan, where I did a 2-year clinical neuropsychology postdoctoral fellowship. After that, I joined the faculty here at the University of Utah and obtained my license from the state to practice clinical neuropsychology. So it can be sort of a long road, but it's one that is continuously stimulating and exciting and challenging. So where might a neuropsychologist work? Where might they be employed? This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but as is demonstrated in this list, A neuropsychologist may work in many different settings, and it's really very exciting to figure out what interests you and how you might apply your training and expertise and think about the various career paths you might take. So a neuropsychologist might work at a hospital or medical center, an academic or research institution. They may work for themselves in private practice. They may work for the Veterans Affairs organizations. They may work in a school. They may work in mental health clinics. They may work in private industry and pharmaceuticals or technology companies, what have you. They may work for the military, or they may work for the government and public health organizations. This flexibility and choice of employment settings is often depends on the specific interests, training, and career goals of the neuropsychologist. And this was one of the reasons that I was drawn to the field, because I knew that I could always do many different things rather than just one thing. And in fact, many neuropsychologists have a combination of roles. So for myself, I work at an academic medical institution, but I also do some work and research down at the VA, and I work for several professional sports teams. Another neuropsychologist has a totally different combination of employment opportunities, and it really is very flexible and very exciting to figure out what you want to do. I hope this was helpful. I thank you for attending, and I hope that this introduction to neuropsychology provides the impetus to learn more and to continue your studies in this area.